Ira. How are you?
I'm great, Amy. Thanks. How are you doing today?
Good. So I've got Ira Gostin here with Gostin Strategic. And so tell us about your company and what you're all about in terms of stakeholder marketing.
What we do is in one level traditional public relations and a little bit of marketing, but we approach it from a different way. And that approach is through stakeholder engagement. And I borrowed the concept from the corporate social responsibility world. They really use that stakeholder piece to make sure that they're broadly talking to everyone that has a concern, not just a client. And we've built the business on doing communications for clients that really cross over traditional boundaries. So it's not just prospects or it's not just vendors, but we look at all the stakeholders of an entity and create a strategy to move forward from there.
So can you give us an example of all the different types of stakeholders you would look at?
So I do a lot in the industrial space, oil and gas and mining, precious metal mining. And when we look at a communication strategy or an investor relations strategy, if it's a public company, it's not just shareholders, it's potential shareholders, it's analysts. Those are the guys from the brokerages that are writing about your company. So they're these financial journalists. They don't show up as a consumer of the product or the company, but they have a great stake in it. There's also investment managers and fund managers. And so all of those stakeholders need to be communicated to, and not necessarily with all the same tactics. So where we might talk to one group a certain way, we'll talk to another group a little bit different way, depending on their knowledge of the company.
So I'm just stuck on something you said originally, and I just kind of want to call it out because I get what you're talking about with stakeholder relations. But you said, and I just think it's an interesting concept. So you said that your communications isn't necessarily about the client, it's about their stakeholders. And so do you kind of have to do some client education in the beginning to say, that the approach might not just be what you think it is. It could be a little bit more than what you think it is, client.
Yeah, absolutely. The first part of this is, we do our onboarding, and then we do a stakeholder engagement consultation with the client, because a lot of times people won't ask. They're like, oh, okay, well, you're the pro, you know what you're doing. I want them to live and breathe what I'm selling. And so I really make sure that they understand that. And kind of a continuing with that mining company analogy, there's two completely split groups. There's institutional investors, and then there's what they call retail investors. So retail investors are you and I. You go to your Schwab account, you want to buy some shares. That communication strategy is completely different than the one for an institutional investor who might be a fund manager at a hedge fund, or in your retirement, you might, see that company. So that's really where, it's a great example, but it's even more so if, let's say, you've got a retail entity, and I'll just make something up that I don't even have as a client, which I don't do that much retail or business to consumer. But let's say it's a boutique and you carry high-end women's clothes on one side of the store and high-end men's clothes and accessories on the other side of the store. Putting out the same messaging and the same story to both audiences doesn't work, because they have totally different needs, values, and trigger points of how they'll respond to the story. So you really pay attention to that. And, the biggest thing in, communications or public relations is, can I get my messaging to take hold so that the consumer does what I want them to do? And by focusing the message and the story to the specific stakeholder group or audience, it really creates a better impact.
Okay. So it's a little tricky in a sense because the clients might not need that they really, or they might not know that they actually need stakeholder marketing or engagement, but they come to you because they think they need PR. Is that how you get most of your clients? And then,
Um, yeah, they start. That phone call starts with, "How much do you charge for a press release?" And I don't do press releases. We create strategies where a press release is one tactic, and they'll either be intrigued and want to know more, or they slam the phone down in my ear. And
mhm.
I prefer that they're intrigued, but I'm okay with either. So um, I want to be able to create a campaign for that client that we can help them move the needle.
Yeah.
That is our role, is helping them achieve growth.
Yeah, and I do want to dig into the stakeholder stuff because I think it's really important right now with what's going on in the world and especially employee relations with us working remotely. But first, I just want to ask you something about, how does this work when you are working with a client that is dealing with kind of a big issue, and how do you move the needle is really the question. And if they have a big issue, how do you know that your communications are working?
Well, I'd love to tell you that's because I'm brilliant, but I'm not sure that's the right answer. So um, we really spend a lot of time on the strategy. And the tactics are the fun part, those tools that we use to get to that audience. But we spend a huge amount of time on the strategy, and we talk it through. And I try to approach everything with a design thinking understanding, which is a consumer centric focus. And that's basically walk in the customer's shoes. So we might test something. We might go talk to, I might email a bunch of friends and put together a quick little survey. If the client's budget allows for it, if they're going to undertake a pretty expensive campaign, we'll look at doing a test market and getting that data back. And then I sit down with them and we go over their goals really carefully. So it's, moving the needle is the best way to tell if you're getting the work done properly. But the client has to open the kimono a little bit and let you into their financials, because I need to understand what their key performance indicators are for the business. So we can look at it's like, okay, well, what we need to do is we need to increase inquiries to the website. We need to track every step of the sales funnel. And then, one of our goals is going to be to increase gross revenue by X%, depending on the industry. Those are not normal PR conversations. But I found that when I can get in and do that, and then we can connect the right strategy to the goals, we are so much more effective. And that's the exciting part, because we're really helping that business move forward with a strategy and then the tactics.
Yeah, and they should be normal PR conversations, really, because so we also do a lot of work in search engine marketing, or we have a lot of friends that work in search. And it seems like digital advertising now is sometimes easier to sell possibly, or just to keep on retainer, like keep those clients, because you can point back to the numbers. And so PR people do need to have these conversations about getting into either the financials or the KPIs if it's clicks that are needed and not financials, just to keep our clients, right?
Yeah. And it's not so much like, I love getting where they say, look, we did this and we did that, and we tripled our web traffic. What happened to your revenue? And a lot of times they don't even know. And it's like, you have to take the web traffic and convert it to the sales funnel. And the sales funnel has stages. And what I found with several clients is they're, if you think of a traditional funnel, they're spilling out in the middle. And what was happening was they were paying all this attention to them at the top of the funnel, getting them into the funnel, and then ignoring them through the sales process, the journey, and they weren't closing or having conversations. So they weren't really qualifying those leads. And when we can have that conversation with the client and they get where we're going with it, it's going to move. If they don't get it, then we kind of help them understand it and do a little bit of coaching and training.
So then as a PR person to have these conversations with clients, do we need to work our way into the C-suite conversations? Because are the marketing managers on the client side able to have these financial conversations with us? I mean, that's where that might be where you are losing a client, on the client side might be losing a piece of the funnel in the middle, is because there's a disconnect between the marketing manager and the C-suite. And then what is the PR person to do if they're not connected?
You're 100% right. And so I had an agency. It was a pretty traditional agency. And then I sold it. And then I went to work for the agency that acquired us. And I decided that I wanted to go back out on my own. And the reason I created a consultancy and not another agency, because I only work with the C-suite now. And what was happening was I was working with marketing managers who didn't understand that conversation, and it was ending. And so it's having a seat at the table is really imperative, because you have to work your way into that when the CEO or the CFO hear you talking about the numbers, they are going to just be like, wow, I've never heard a PR person talk like that before. But that's where we should be striving to go as public relations professionals, is having those conversations and having that seat at the table.
Yeah, and you only need to do that. It's not a threat or anything. You need to do that because you can't be effective for your clients if you're not doing that, or it's that, or maybe that's not the right phrase. The goal is to be effective for your client. So it's not about pumping out a bunch of press releases or even getting press coverage. We want to be effective. So then you do need to have those conversations, and that's the only reason.
Yeah, I didn't actually get this client. It would be a fabulous story if I had landed them, but I didn't. They hired somebody in-house and hired me to help them find a great individual, which worked out wonderfully. But they had worked with an agency previously that got them a huge piece on CBS This Morning. And I said, that's amazing. What did your revenue do in that quarter? He had no idea. The agency that got them on CBS This Morning presented them with the value of the piece, but not the value to the growth of the company. And at the end of the day, I said, what happened? And so he called the CFO in, and the CFO looked at the numbers on his computer and said, okay, well, we were flat. So I can tell you that CBS morning show piece did nothing. And I said, well, then take the $53,000 that you paid that agency last year, and next year just go to Vegas and put it on black. And, you have a better chance of doubling your money. So, and my point was that if you don't build trackable metrics into the strategy and the campaign, you're never going to be able to measure what you're doing. And at the end of the day, all he got was a message from his grandmother telling him, good job, I saw you on CBS.
Yeah.
Cool for the family, but not great for the business.
And so then how do you take the conversation and change it away from press coverage to, well, I guess this is a multi-part question, but to, marketing towards different stakeholders? And then also, or the second part of the question is, do you ever use press coverage to move the needle personally?
the quality and the quantity of the press coverage is always going to be an indicator. We're always going to use it as a metric because it is important, but it's never going to be the first one. Either revenue growth or contact growth, or a bigger enterprise where they've got a sales team and all of the salespeople are saying our inbound lead is up 25%. That's a much better indicator because that means that we've affected change. People are seeing the story or the message and they're doing something. They're picking up the phone and calling an 800 number, or they're emailing, or they're going to a website. So there's some activity that's happening. If revenue doesn't increase, sales don't increase, then we're going to look at, okay, what's happening from the top of the sales funnel to the bottom? There's a gap. And what's causing that gap? And as silly as it sounds, like probably the most important thing that I learned in getting an MBA was the gap analysis tool. And it's just taking something that happened over here and something that happened over here and trying to figure out why there's a gap between those two items. And it's never was, not something I learned in journalism school. And it's not something that made sense to me when I heard it. But the first time I used it, it was like, oh, I just uncovered some total gem of information. And then that was really cool. And
so then
it's super important.
I'm glad you brought up the MBA because I was going to bring that up. So did you also have a financial type of degree as well, or is that your financial degree?
That's my financial. So that's a funny story. So I got my MBA, and and they're pretty much all the same setup. There's 3 courses in a row of financial. There's like statistics and finance and then accounting. And, I hadn't taken a math class since I was in sophomore in high school, I think, which I got my MBA really late. So I hadn't been in school in a really long time. And I was older than half my professors, I think. And so I just kept saying to myself, you're a marketing guy. You never need to know this stuff again. And when we did the financial modeling, you're figuring out the net present value and the future value of the cash flow. I just have to pass the class. I never will do this ever again. 2 years later, I go to work for a startup getting ready to IPO mining company. And mining companies don't move an outhouse without figuring out what the net present value and the individual rate of return is on moving from point A to point B. So I took that semester class over again at the Colorado School of Mines in a 3.5-day class. And it was brutal, but it all kind of clicked. And it was like, okay, it's in mining, and I knew all the terminology. And so it was great. Fast forward 7 years later, I depart the mining company and start to open up this agency. And we picked up an oil and gas client, and we were just doing PR, but it was going to move into more. I took the class a 3rd time at NYU, and it was geared a little more general, not so much specific to mining. Some of the terminology was a little bit different. So I've taken this finance class 3 times.
Well, hey, it's probably
I think I got it a little bit.
Yeah.
I'm certainly not an analyst by any stretch, but I can take those concepts and communicate them as part of the story.
Yeah. And so was it that class that caused you to look at marketing differently, or was it?
Absolutely. It really, in the PR industry, this conversation's been going on as long as I've been around it, which is how do we measure the effectiveness? And for me, coming out of investor relations, we measure the effectiveness of our story and the department by what was the share price doing. And sure, there are things where, outside influences, there's a hurricane in Central America that was affecting production, and your stock price drops a little bit. But once you remove all those things, as we would go to conferences and tell the story, and as the story started to grow, and we talked to more and more stakeholders, and the share price appreciated, that was how we knew we were doing a good job. And it was like, okay, how do I take that concept and apply it to public relations? Because it worked in investor relations, and the way to do that is to have that conversation with the C-suite where you're saying, let me help you understand how we can help, and then you help me understand what you need to see out of this to be able to judge its effectiveness.
And so what you do you get together and do kind of check-ins like every month or on a schedule to know how it's going with
I
your
talk to
CEO?
my clients every week, and then at the end of the quarter, I will check in with the CFO, and I have a contract analyst that I use, and it's his job just to put the numbers in order. So we'll get the financials, and we'll pull out those 5 or 7 key performance indicators, plug them into the model that we've built, and it's pretty simple at that point. It's either red or green. Hopefully it's all green. If it's red, then we have a different conversation about what didn't work.
And then, so you do strategy for them as well. And then what are the various like outputs, I guess, tactics or things, mechanical type things that you create for each stakeholder? So is it messaging or newsletters or what is it, like the content piece?
It's all the same things that a traditional public relations agency does. One of my favorite things right now is to do a news release in a certain, especially if it's market variable. So let's say we've got a client where they've got operations in 3 different states. So we're doing a news release to those 3 areas, and then we underneath it do a digital ad campaign. And what I found is when you combine those 2 things, you get this increased third effect, and we just call it 1 + 1 = 3. So we're tying 2 kind of independent things together to get a greater third effect, and it's pretty interesting. But some clients might need a newsletter, some might not. Some might want a lot of formatting. We started doing video messages from the C-suite. So it's really having that conversation. If the CEO is dynamic and a great speaker, I want him or her out and talking to people, and I want them presenting and visible and doing videos. If they're not comfortable, I don't push it. Like, we try to do a little bit of training, but I don't want to push it where they feel uncomfortable. So we'll come up with something different.
So what is you were saying the press releases with the digital ad, and you said the increased third effect. I don't know, that might be a math term or whatever, but, does that mean?
I made it up.
So, but what is the third effect? Is it more clicks to a website or just whatever you're trying to drive? Or
Right.
is
So
it just digital
if a
presence?
news release would normally get you X and on its own, and a digital campaign would get you Y, and you can piggyback them together so that you get a greater result from the combination of the 2 than either one of those would do on its own. And that's what we're looking for, is how can we maximize our spend? Like everything else, clients don't have a lot of budget for buy. So how can we maximize that spend?
Okay. So right now, there were 2 issues that I kind of briefly mentioned, but then skipped over and then straight into the moving the needle topic. But I mentioned kind of crisis and then also employee relations. And I think I want to just talk about employee relations first but I know a lot of that's going on right now. So employee relations is huge for people who are working from home, and or if you are dealing with a crisis like a coronavirus outbreak in-house, like in an office or a workplace, What would your suggestions be to those types of situations?
So I'm working with an agency, and they, once this outbreak happened and everybody was working from home, they recognized that the efficiency had been dropping dramatically. And so I kind of monitor everything and looked at the efficiency of their communications. And what had happened was they went from, knock on the door frame, hey, you got a minute, to Zoom. And what I also noticed was that um, um, their communications was either a little bit on Slack, but mostly on Zoom. So it was all audible, and people were getting instructions for assignments. So I did a survey with the employees and found out that the entire team, their specific learning domains, Audible was the bottom of every single employee.
You mean like how they learn?
How they learn.
Yeah, and I've heard that Audible is the hardest. That's why school is hard for some people, like lectures.
When I was doing my undergrad, I had a typewriter, and so I would handwrite my notes, and then I would go home every night and I would type them up. Never looked at them again. The mere act of typing the notes, and I didn't realize this many years later until I wound up taking classes in vocational education and how we learn, because I thought that it was important as a marketer to understand the cognitive functions of the brain. So here I've got a team of people, and I know this is weird because my agency does a little bit of operational support too. But we realized, it's like when we talked about it with the partners, it's like, okay, nobody is soaking all this in. We've got to piggyback stuff. So what I did was just implemented a tiny little program of, hey, can you help me with this? Oh yeah, not a problem. And then immediately sending a message on Slack. Hey, thanks for the help. Here's what I need.
Okay.
And slowly we're turning the tide on that. But the big picture is stakeholders includes employees. And it's very overlooked. It's so commonly overlooked where companies don't communicate to their team what they're doing. So you've got like the CMO off here, and he or she's off doing this whole campaign thing, and they got the celebrity involved, and the people in the marketing department have no idea that that's going on. So it's really trying, and I mean, especially now, make sure that your team knows what you're doing and what's going on, and having conversations, and maybe having a call that just is like, hey, there's some kind of crazy stuff going on in our country right now, and does anybody want to talk about it as a team? Does anybody have any part of this that they want to discuss? Giving a safe space on Zoom that we can have that conversation, to let your team know that you care about them, that if there's something happening that affects you, we should know about it, and discuss it. So I think that whole stakeholder communications piece is very apropos right now.
Okay. And then it's only going to be more and more important when people go back to work. So, well, workplace, they're all at work, but going back to the workplace, we're going to have to think about that, and also think about their comfort level. Or if you have an essential industry where you have workers having to go to work, either because you just got to keep business going, or they actually want to get paid, which that would make sense. But then there's fears around catching coronavirus. So then, I don't know if you have any thoughts on how to deal with that, with coronavirus outbreaks. And then that would be a crisis issue as well.
So my wife is a registered nurse, and she works in a hospital, and she's a supervising nurse. And so she supervises the COVID unit. And So the good news is that we don't have a whole lot of people just stopping by our house, and
Yeah, that
but
might be nice right now.
it's it is interesting, and um, there's it always comes down to communications. I am assuming that everybody that's listening to this has gotten at least one of those emails. Dear customer, during these tumultuous times, or during these times of crisis, or whatever it is, and they're kind of insincere, and they handed it to their internal communications team, and I promise you that none of them stopped to go, what do you think the recipient of this email is going to think about us when they read it? And they're going to think that, boy, their sincerity level is pretty fraudulent.
Hmm.
Um, and I've to me, marketing is about asking that question: how can I help you? How can I help your business? As a marketer, as a communicator, what can I do to help you? And just by asking that, you're letting your clients know, or your prospect clients, that you're really interested in their success. Um, so it's really a time to be communicating to everybody, and it doesn't have to be overly produced. Um, when I was in grad school, I worked at Starbucks, and I'm a Starbucks fan because I went through their management program, and I learned so much about how a company crafts the story and the message. And it's so important. And theirs was probably the only one that I received. And it wasn't a COVID one. It was about race crisis in America. And it was, we're still here for you as that third place. We're opening stores. We want to have that conversation, and we want to be part of the dialogue. And they're, um, I haven't had that many actual jobs. I've been on my own most of my career, but it was such a diverse company, and I learned so much about diversity from Starbucks. But it's like, we should be having those difficult conversations. And the way that a company can be successful right now is, don't make it uncomfortable. Just get past the awkwardness and have the conversation.
Yeah, just be warm and sincere and be true to yourself.
Authentic. Yeah.
And then admit that you don't know everything, because that might be a start. And just admit that everybody can do better, because we all can.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely.
so yeah, I guess was there anything that I didn't ask that you think I should have, or anything that you want to say in terms of all of these crises that we have going on here? Because that is, with PR, in PR, we're working on it. That's kind of what we're working on, are a couple of crises.
Yeah, I don't do crisis communications per se. I think right now we're all sort of doing a little bit of that and advising our clients. I, to me, communications is the voice of business success, and it's, I'm a capitalist, and I say that in all the positive ways. I love our free market system. Can we do better? Absolutely. Can companies do better? Across the board, I would say yes. But I feel that the system that we have is great. So when I get an opportunity to work with a business and help them move the needle, I think it's super important. And we grow together and tell their story.
Wonderful. Is there a way that people can find you online, or reach out to you?
Yeah, my website is simply my full name, iragostin.com. That's GOSTIN.com. And you can reach me there, and feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn or any of the social channels.